His sister became pregnant by him as a teenager. A sentence that echoes through the dark mountains of Tennessee, carrying decades of silence and shame. This is the history of the Sullivan family, whose roots intertwined in forbidden ways deep in the Appalachians, resulting in consequences that would ripple across generations. It was 1967. While America was swept up in freedom movements and the Vietnam War dominated the headlines, a completely different world existed in the isolated mountains of eastern Tennessee. In a remote community known as the Valley of Shadows, the Sullivan family lived virtually cut off from modern society. Thomas Sullivan, the 48-year-old patriarch, had built a life away from prying eyes, alone since his wife's death 5 years prior. He raised his 4 children by himself in a rudimentary cabin, Elijah, the oldest at 19, Margaret, 16, Sarah, 13, and the youngest, Timothy, just 9. To the local community, the Sullivans were just another poor family, struggling for survival against the hardships of mountain life. This isolation was no accident. For 3 generations, the Sullivans had deliberately kept apart from the outside world. Thomas's own father had been a cousin to his mother, and Thomas had married a second-degree cousin. This pattern of relationships wasn't entirely uncommon in the most isolated Appalachian communities of that era. The first signs that something was terribly wrong at the Sullivan cabin emerged when 16-year-old Margaret began missing classes at the small schoolhouse. Teacher Mary Whitfield, one of the few people who maintained regular contact with the family, noticed the girl's prolonged absence. Margaret had always been a quiet but intelligent girl, Mary would later state. When she stopped coming to school and her brother Elijah started giving increasingly elaborate excuses, I felt something was off. What Mary could not imagine was the true dimension of the horror unfolding in that cabin. Elijah Sullivan, the older brother, had developed an improper relationship with his sister Margaret. Exploiting their father's frequent absences for work on neighboring farms, Elijah had begun to dominate his sister, a situation that ultimately resulted in pregnancy. I noticed Margaret was wearing looser clothes, even on hot days, her younger sister Sarah later recalled. Elijah forbade us to speak of it. He said Margaret was sick and it was a private family matter. The family dynamics were ruled by control and fear. After their mother's death, Elijah had assumed a position of disproportionate authority. Thomas, consumed by work and grief, failed to see how his eldest son had twisted the family hierarchy. The situation reached a crisis when the worried teacher, Mary Whitfield, decided to visit the Sullivan cabin after nearly 4 months without seeing Margaret. What she discovered would forever alter that family's fate. On a rainy October afternoon, Mary traveled the muddy road to the Sullivans' isolated property. There, she found Margaret alone, visibly pregnant and in a state of profound emotional distress. She was sitting on the porch and looked like a completely different person, Mary reported to social services later. When she saw me, she began to cry in a way I will never forget. It was then that the first layer of the Sullivan secret began to unravel, revealing a behavioral pattern spanning generations, yet never confronted so directly. Check now if you're subscribed to the channel. If you value true stories that expose the hidden truths of American society, you can't miss our next episodes. Every subscription helps us continue uncovering these forgotten stories that, as painful as they may be, need to be told to understand our own history. Mary Whitfield's visit triggered a chain of events that would drag decades of family secrets into the light. After finding Margaret in an advanced state of pregnancy, the teacher contacted local authorities. Sheriff John Caldwell, a 54-year-old man who had spent his entire life in the county, answered the call. Arriving at the Sullivan property the next day, he encountered a scene that, even after 30 years of police work, would haunt him for life. I walked into that cabin and knew immediately something was deeply wrong, Caldwell noted in his 1967 report. The girl was clearly pregnant. Her older brother seemed threatening, and her father simply wouldn't look anyone in the eye. During initial questioning, the family tried to maintain a story that Margaret had been involved with a boy from another community who had left to fight in Vietnam. But 13-year-old Sarah eventually revealed the truth when questioned separately. Elijah said we were special. Sarah's words were recorded in the police report. He said that in the mountains, old families like ours had different rules than town people. The ensuing investigation uncovered not just the improper relationship between Elijah and Margaret, but a disturbing generational pattern. Examination of Sullivan family records revealed a lineage marked by unions between close cousins for at least 4 generations. The case caught the attention of Dr. William Thornton, a physician at the small local clinic who had trained at Johns Hopkins. Thornton immediately recognized the physical signs of prolonged consanguinity in the family. Timothy, the youngest, had significant learning difficulties and an atypical cranial formation, Dr. Thornton noted in his medical report. Sarah showed severe vision problems and impaired motor development. These are classic signs of a high degree of inbreeding. Elijah Sullivan was arrested and formally charged, but the 1967 judiciary in rural, conservative Tennessee was ill-equipped for such a complex case. Authorities debated whether to treat it as a conventional crime or as the result of isolated cultural practices requiring a different approach. In the following weeks, the extremely limited local social services tried to support Margaret. The 16-year-old was now in her 7th month, confused and traumatized. She didn't fully understand what had happened to her, explained Elizabeth Morrow, the assigned social worker. Margaret grew up in a separate world, where the normal rules of society didn't apply. The Sullivan story began to spread through the region, first in whispers, then as a disturbing case study of what could happen in isolated communities. For locals, it provoked a mix of horror and a reluctant recognition that some mountain families lived by their own rules. The investigation revealed even more troubling details about the family dynamics. Thomas Sullivan had grown up under similar conditions. His own father had married a close cousin. Geographical and social isolation had been a deliberate strategy for generations. Parish records from the small local church dating to the 1910s already noted concerns about mountain families who refused to mix. A pastor from that time had tried to intervene but met fierce resistance and eventually gave up. But it was Margaret's health that now most concerned the involved doctors. At 6 months pregnant, she showed alarming signs. Her blood pressure was dangerously high, and initial exams suggested the fetus might have serious malformations. A pregnancy resulting from such close consanguinity carries significantly increased risks, Dr. Thornton explained in the medical records. Harmful recessive genes, which would usually remain dormant in a diverse population, are far more likely to be expressed when close relatives have children. Knoxville University Hospital, with its bright corridors and white-coated medical teams, was a completely foreign world to Margaret Sullivan. The 16-year-old, who had spent her life in the mountain shadows, was now under fluorescent lights, surrounded by machines she barely understood. Dr. Richard Coleman, a high-risk obstetric specialist, took over the case after Margaret's transfer. His first meeting with the teenager was etched in his memory and later in his records. The patient showed clear signs of chronic malnutrition and a lack of basic prenatal care, noted Dr. Coleman. Furthermore, I observed subtle but distinctive facial characteristics suggesting she was herself the product of some degree of consanguinity. Initial exams confirmed the local doctor's fears. Margaret's pregnancy, the result of a union with her biological brother, had multiple complications. Ultrasound, a relatively new technology in 1967, revealed the fetus had abnormal brain development and possible heart malformations. When we performed that first ultrasound, the entire team fell silent, Nurse Janet Wilkins recalled years later. It was an image none of us were prepared to see. As doctors debated the course of action, Margaret's health continued to deteriorate. She developed preeclampsia, a dangerous condition of high blood pressure. The medical team was forced to induce labor prematurely when Margaret was about 32 weeks along. The birth occurred on a cold November night in 1967. The baby, a boy, entered the world with multiple congenital conditions, including microcephaly, cardiac defects, and pronounced facial deformities. He was immediately placed in neonatal intensive care. While Margaret fought for her own life, the baby, temporarily recorded as male Sullivan, lived only 72 hours. His organs, compromised by multiple malformations, could not sustain basic life functions. Sedated for much of that time, Margaret never saw her son. The death of the Sullivan baby was not just a personal tragedy, but a case study later documented in medical literature on the genetic risks of close consanguinity. With judicial authorization, Dr. Coleman collected samples for genetic studies that would reveal alarming patterns of homozygosity. While the Sullivan baby became a medical case, Margaret faced her own physical and psychological recovery. The young woman now had to process not only the physical trauma, but also the gradual understanding of the nature of her relationship with her brother and the family practices normalized in her world. She was repeatedly asked about her family, especially Sarah and Timothy, said psychologist Dr. Marianne Lewis, assigned to her case. Margaret didn't show a conventional understanding that what happened was wrong. For her, it was simply the world she knew. Meanwhile, the judicial case against Elijah Sullivan proceeded. District Attorney Richard Bennett faced the challenge of prosecuting a case that, while clearly criminal by wider societal standards, was rooted in isolated cultural practices. In court, 14-year-old Sarah Sullivan was called to testify. Her testimony, shielded from the press due to her age, was described by those present as deeply disturbing. She detailed how Elijah had gradually assumed control after their mother's death. Elijah always said the outside world wanted to destroy our family, Sarah's testimony stated. He said our ancestors moved to the valley to preserve our blood, and it was our duty to continue what they started. I want you to say in the comments, the truth needs to be exposed even when painful. This message represents our collective commitment to uncovering stories that, however difficult, help us understand the complexity of the human condition. When the fall of 1968 painted the Tennessee mountains in reds and golds, the Valley of Shadows looked unchanged to the casual eye. But for those who knew its recent history, something fundamental had shifted. The Sullivan cabin stood in the same place, but it was empty, its darkened windows like closed eyes. Elijah Sullivan had been sentenced to 15 years in prison, a sentence considered severe at the time. Judge Arthur Blackwood made it clear the case represented a line that could not be crossed, even in isolated communities. Traditions have their place in society, Judge Blackwood said. But when cultural practices result in clear harm to vulnerable family members, the law must intervene. Thomas Sullivan, the patriarch, faced his own judgment for neglect and passive complicity. He received a suspended sentence due to a psychological evaluation identifying limited cognitive capacity, likely a result of generations of inbreeding, but he permanently lost custody of his minor children. For Sarah and Timothy, a new life began. Initially placed in temporary homes, they were eventually adopted. The adaptation was particularly challenging for Timothy, whose cognitive limitations required specialized care. Timothy had not just intellectual challenges, but a deep confusion about basic social norms, his adoptive mother, Ruth Campbell, explained in later interviews. He grew up in an environment where family boundaries were distorted beyond recognition. For Sarah, the transition was different but equally complex. Intellectually perceptive, she wrestled with conflicting feelings of family loyalty and a growing understanding of how abnormal her upbringing had been. I loved my family, Sarah confided to her therapist. But as I began living with my foster family and attending a normal school, I realized what happened in our cabin wasn't how other families lived. Margaret, meanwhile, faced her own journey of recovery and rediscovery. After months in a specialized institution, she was gradually introduced to a semi-independent living program. By 1970, at age 19, she had developed basic skills for life in wider society, though the emotional trauma remained deeply rooted. Margaret has made remarkable progress considering her starting point, Dr. Lewis noted in a final report. She learned to read more fluently, developed basic social skills, and began to form a healthier understanding of appropriate relationships. One of the most lasting consequences of the Sullivan case was its impact on medical and scientific understanding of consanguinity. The genetic samples and family lineage data became reference material in research on the effects of unions between close relatives. Dr. Thornton, continuing his work in population genetics, identified what he termed the Sullivan effect, the exponential increase in genetic risks when a lineage already compromised by generations of inbreeding experiences a sibling union. The Sullivan case allowed us to document how risks accumulate across generations, Thornton explained in a 1973 lecture at Johns Hopkins. Each generation of close unions increases homozygosity. The case significantly contributed to the development of genetic counseling as a medical discipline, with lessons applied to isolated communities and populations with high rates of consanguineous marriage worldwide. In 1975, nearly 8 years after the initial events, a university documentary team visited the region to produce an educational film on isolated Appalachian communities. While not naming the Sullivans directly, the documentary Mountain Shadows addressed isolation, poverty, and marriage practices. One impactful moment was an anonymous interview with a young woman informed viewers recognized as Sarah Sullivan, then 21. With her face obscured and voice altered, she offered a unique perspective. Outside people see only the horror. And yes, it was horrible. But it was also our daily reality. We grew up believing the outside world was dangerous and only our family was safe. Winter arrived early in the Tennessee mountains in 1990, covering the peaks in white by November. In the small town of Cedar Ridge, about 70 kilometers from the old Valley of Shadows, nurse Sarah Morris, formerly Sullivan, watched the snow from her small home window. At 36, Sarah had built a life few could have predicted. A nursing graduate specializing in rural health, she had married David Morris, a local teacher, and adopted a girl, consciously choosing not to have biological children based on her family history. Before we married, I told David everything, Sarah wrote in a personal diary later donated to the University of Tennessee. I explained the genetic risks I might carry and my fear of passing on any hereditary predisposition. One December morning, she received a letter reopening carefully closed chapters of her life. It was from Elijah, released from prison 3 years prior after serving his full 15-year sentence. Dear Sarah, the letter began. I know you probably don't want to hear from me, and I understand if you toss this out unread. But if you are reading this, I want you to know I've spent the last 20 years trying to understand what I did and why. For Sarah, the letter forced a collision between her compartmentalized past and the life she had built. After days of deliberation, she decided to respond, beginning a cautious correspondence that led to a supervised meeting in 1991. This facilitated reunion, involving a family therapist, was significant not just for the siblings, but for the professionals who had followed the case for decades. Margaret Sullivan had followed a different path. After years in support programs, she found stability working in a Knoxville hospital kitchen. Refusing to change her last name and maintaining a consciously limited connection to her past, she built a quiet, functional life. In 1992, as academic interest resurged on the 25th anniversary of the events, Margaret surprised many by agreeing to an interview for a study on trauma resilience. People always ask if I hate my brother or my father, she said. The truth is more complicated. How can I completely hate people who, in their own distorted way, believed they were following the rules of the only world they knew? But also, how can I not be angry for what was taken from me? Both things are true at once. Timothy Sullivan, the youngest, continued to live in a support facility. His cognitive and physical problems, likely resulting from generations of inbreeding, limited his options, but within a structured environment, he found a measure of contentment. The scientific impact of the Sullivan case continued to evolve with advances in genetics. In the 1990s, with more sophisticated genetic analysis and the Human Genome Project, researchers revisited the preserved samples and data. In 1995, the Tennessee Health Department established the Mountain Health Program to provide health education and services to isolated rural communities, a program widely understood to be inspired by lessons from the Sullivan case. The old Sullivan cabin, abandoned for decades, finally collapsed during a winter storm in 1997, symbolically marking an era's end. Where a dysfunctional family once lived, the forest reclaimed its territory. In 2000, 33 years after the original events, the University of Tennessee established the Sullivan Center for Rural Studies, dedicated to researching geographical isolation, cultural practices in remote communities, and interventions for vulnerable populations. We can't change what happened, Sarah said at the inauguration ceremony, speaking publicly of her history for the first time. But we can ensure our family's suffering wasn't in vain. That the lessons learned will help protect other vulnerable families for generations to come. People want simple stories, Margaret noted in her last known interview in 2002. They want monsters and victims, villains and heroes. But the truth is almost never that simple. Our family was created by generations of isolation, ignorance, and fear. What happened to us was terrible, but it was also the result of forces larger than any individual. If you've watched this far, it's because this story resonated with you. Leave a comment saying, "Watched here," so I can get to know you and see who truly appreciates these stories on the channel. Be sure to subscribe to follow more stories like this, ones that reveal the dark secrets of American families. Your support is crucial for us to continue bringing these important, if painful, stories to light. If this story moved you in any way, please leave a like and share it with others who appreciate educational content about historical cases. The truth needs to be exposed, even when painful.